me get to the next page, attended a holiday dinner at, I redacted the name, of Raleigh, North Carolina with the Lassiters and other guests. Plaintiff Mrs. D, plaintiff Mrs. Lassiter and defendant Tim Moore have all been, I redacted this, basically social media, friends for more than 5 years. During the time that defendant Tim Moore has been, I redacted the name of the social media company, social media friends with plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter. The Lassiters frequently posted photos of themselves as a couple, basically saying they posted themselves as a couple on social media is the allegation. E, defendant Tim Moore accepted campaign contributions from both plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter for his North Carolina House of Representatives election campaigns. Beginning in 2019 and continuing through and beyond January 11th, 2023, defendant Tim Moore aggressively pursued I forgot to redact that one. You can see it right there, what it is. I'm not going to say it. A blank relationship with Mrs. Lassiter, even though he knew that she was married to and living with plaintiff. Plaintiff discovered defendant Tim Moore's affair with Mrs. Lassiter on December 21st, 2022. After hearing persistent rumors about an inappropriate relationship between defendant Tim Moore and Mrs. Lassiter, which Mrs. Lassiter had repeatedly denied, plaintiff surveilled Mrs. Lassiter on the evening of December 21st, 2022, the Wednesday before Christmas, and the beginning of her holiday vacation from work. She had told plaintiff that she was going to a movie with one of her female friends. Instead of going to a movie, Mrs. Lassiter went to dinner with defendant Tim Moore at, I redacted the name of the steakhouse, in Raleigh, North Carolina. After dinner, defendant Tim Moore drove Mrs. Lassiter in the Lassiter's car to his residence in Raleigh, where they spent hours together and upon information and belief had, I redacted the explicit content. A photo of defendant Tim Moore and Mrs. Lassiter leaving, I redacted the name of the steakhouse, together at approximately 11 p.m. that evening is attached hereto as Exhibit C and incorporated by reference herein. Okay, so that's another one of the exhibits that was actually shown in the newscast I already covered, and it talks about, or shows, this picture alleging him and her leaving the steakhouse together on a particular evening. Which I find interesting, the whole surveillance aspect of this. Okay, but it just gets honestly stranger from here. When Mrs. Lassiter returned home in the early morning hours of December 22nd, 2022, much later than she had told plaintiff she would be out for the movie, plaintiff confronted her about her relationship with defendant Tim Moore. Mrs. Lassiter tearfully confessed that she had been involved in an extramarital affair with defendant Tim Moore for more than 3 years. That she had engaged in, I redacted explicit activity with defendant Tim Moore, including, I redacted explicit activity with other individuals seeking defendant Tim Moore's political favor, and that she feared ending the relationship with defendant Tim Moore would result in losing her job. Plaintiff insisted that defendant Tim Moore meet with him. So the husband insisted that defendant, the House Speaker Tim Moore, meet with him at this is going to be the Biscuitville. So plaintiff could confront him about the affair with Mrs. Lassiter. On December 26, 2022, plaintiff and defendant Tim Moore, right after Christmas. Plaintiff and defendant Tim Moore met at Biscuitville on Western Boulevard in Raleigh, North Carolina. I will be going to the Biscuitville here shortly and posting my picture on social media. I'm going to this Biscuitville. This Biscuitville is getting extra business. When plaintiff questioned defendant Tim Moore, he admitted to having a multi-year relationship with Mrs. Lassiter. Near the end of the meeting, defendant Tim Moore asked plaintiff quote, on a completely unrelated note, end quote, if there was anything he could do for plaintiff, implying that he could use the power he held as speaker in some way to benefit plaintiff. Plaintiff angrily told defendant Tim Moore that he did not want any political favors. In the weeks following plaintiff's discovery of defendant Tim Moore's relationship with Mrs. Lassiter, the Lassiters attempted to work through the marital problems associated with Mrs. Lassiter's infidelity, including participating in religious and therapeutic counseling. Mrs. Lassiter was adamant that she wanted to save their marriage, but could not end her relationship with defendant Tim Moore for fear of retaliation. Mrs. Lassiter implored plaintiff to allow her to continue the relationship, so her job. Mrs. Lassiter implored plaintiff to allow her to continue the relationship, so her job an at-will position that is statutorily created and directly funded by the North Carolina General Assembly in the interest of the NC Conference of Clerks would not be adversely affected by defendant Tim Moore's anticipated displeasure over a potential breakup. Mrs. Lassiter begged plaintiff to understand that she had got herself into something she could not couldn't get out of. Got herself into something she couldn't get out of, referring to her relationship with defendant Tim Moore. Plaintiff told Mrs. Lassiter that they could not remain married unless she ended her relationship with defendant Tim Moore. Because Mrs. Lassiter said she was uncomfortable extricating herself from that relationship, plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter separated on January 11, 2023. First claim for relief, criminal conversation. Paragraphs 1 through 12 above are hereby re-alleged and incorporated by reference as if fully set forth herein. Upon information and belief beginning in or around 2019, continuing through and beyond January 11, 2023, defendant and Mrs. Lassiter were physically intimate, including redacted explicit content in North Carolina on multiple occasions at locations that include but are not limited to the following: defendant Tim Moore's condominium and I redacted the personal address of this person. Raleigh, North Carolina, I redacted the zip code of this personal address for this person. And defendant Tim Moore's condominium located at, also redacted the personal address of this person. Raleigh, North Carolina, I redacted the personal zip code of the address for this person. Again, all of the redacted information is still publicly available, but I just made the choice to do that. Between 2019 and January 11, 2023, defendant knowingly and willingly engaged in redacted explicit content with Mrs. Lassiter in North Carolina while plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter were lawfully married and not separated. Plaintiff has been injured by defendant Tim Moore's adulterous extramarital relationship with Mrs. Lassiter. Plaintiff's damages include but are not limited to the loss of support and companionship of Mrs. Lassiter, humiliation, injury to his reputation, and mental anguish resulting from the destruction of his marriage. Plaintiff has been damaged by defendant Tim Moore's adulterous extramarital relationship with Mrs. Lassiter in an amount in excess of $25,000. So this is going to be getting into like kind of money, the legal money stuff here. And this is actually like towards the end. This is another reason I kind of cut off a huge chunk of this complaint, because it just gets into like all this money stuff. And it's like, I really don't care to cover all the money stuff. I mean, you can see here, the civil suit includes requests for damages, basically involves money. So you can see that. Second claim for relief, alienation of affections. Paragraphs 1 through 17 above are hereby re-alleged and incorporated by reference as if fully set forth herein. Prior to defendant Tim Moore's extramarital relationship with Mrs. Lassiter, plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter were happily married and genuine love and affection existed between them. Upon information and belief, defendant Tim Moore committed the following acts in North Carolina during the time period from 2019 through January 11, 2023, which acts were designed to alienate Mrs. Lassiter from plaintiff. Defendant Tim Moore used his position as Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives to initiate contact and develop a personal relationship with Mrs. Lassiter, despite knowing that she was married to plaintiff. Defendant Tim Moore engaged in, I redacted this, with Mrs. Lassiter on many occasions over multiple years, despite knowing that Mrs. Lassiter was married to plaintiff. Defendant Tim Moore convinced Mrs. Lassiter to engage in degrading, I redacted this explicit content with him, including, I redacted this explicit content with others over whom he had power or influence. Defendant Tim Moore called and sent text messages and emails to Mrs. Lassiter, including with his state government phone, when he knew that she was home with plaintiff in order to interfere with Mrs. Lassiter's time with her husband and alienate her from plaintiff. Defendant Tim Moore persuaded Mrs. Lassiter to lie to plaintiff regarding her whereabouts so that she would sacrifice time with plaintiff to spend time with him. Defendant Tim Moore made statements to Mrs. Lassiter that caused her to believe her job and the position of the NC Conference of Clerks would be adversely affected if she ended their relationship. Defendant Tim Moore's wrongful and malicious acts deprived plaintiff of Mrs. Lassiter's love, society, companionship, and consortium, and proximately caused the marital separation of plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter. As a result of defendant Tim Moore's wrongful and malicious actions, the genuine love and affection that existed between plaintiff and Mrs. Lassiter was alienated and destroyed. Plaintiff has been injured by defendant Tim Moore's wrongful and malicious acts, which resulted in the destruction of his marriage to Mrs. Lassiter. Plaintiff has been damaged by defendant Tim Moore's alienation. Okay, so this talks about money. All right, so third claim, skipping ahead now. Third claim, civil conspiracy. Paragraphs 1 through 24 above are hereby re-alleged and incorporated by reference as if fully set forth herein. Upon information and belief, a conspiracy existed between defendant Tim Moore and defendant John Doe to commit wrongful